Even if we are faithless, God remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Faithfulness is a part of God's character, and it should be part of our character. Well, part of our faithfulness should be doing the right thing. We should be faithful to do the right thing. And voting is something that we should not allow our emotions to be swayed and say, well, my vote doesn't matter, but your faithfulness does.
I'm so glad to be joined with Tim Barton. He is the president of Wall Builders. Thank you, Tim, for joining us and having a conversation with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, so Wall Builders, you guys are focusing on Americans and educating us on the Constitution.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So we focus on American history and specifically understanding the connection, the biblical foundation of America. And to do that, we actually have what's considered the largest private collection of original documents from the founding fathers, from the founding era. We have letters, documents, journals from any founding father you can name. We have about 100,000 plus items in the collection. So what we do is we go back to the original documents, and what we can show very clearly is the most influential document to the founding fathers was the Bible, right? The most influential philosophy was Christianity, the philosophy of Jesus, and it shows up in so much of what they do. And as we're looking at the world and culture today, the two things we're trying to help in kind of our niche of what we feel God's called us to is we want to teach people American history, because there's so many lies right now being said about America, right? Where people that should be celebrated, honored as heroes, their statues are being torn down.
Yeah.
And it's because we have a very faulty understanding of history. We've been lied to. We've bought the lie, the adage that if you repeat a lie often enough, right, that's what people believe.
Everybody starts believing it.
And that's exactly what's happened with so many founding fathers. And then not just the understanding connection from the founding fathers, but we want people to see what the founding fathers did that put us on a path to be the most free, stable, prosperous nation in the history of the world was following biblical principles. And it actually makes a lot of sense. As a Christian, it should make the most sense because God's ways work. And when you do it God's way, you're successful. And you can track where some presidents, some leaders, they were terrible and America suffered because of it. And then you had some leaders that made good decisions and America benefited because of it. But the good and bad decisions, we would say the measurement of the metric is what the Bible says, right? Because God's ways work. Go back to Deuteronomy 28, where Moses tells Israelites, before you go, and remember, if you do it God's way, everywhere you go, everything you'll do, you'll be blessed. But if you don't go do it God's way, then you suffer those consequences. And the founding fathers set up a system that allowed freedom to thrive and function, but it only thrived and functioned because of the moral foundation they laid.
Yeah. Let me just kind of ask you on that, being that we are, and I believe this, I'm right here with you, that we are founded on these biblical principles.
Yeah.
What do you say to those people? They're like, oh, we weren't founded on the biblical, like all that stuff is garbage. You hear all those naysayers. Like, what do you say to those people?
So generally we will ask questions to find out more of where they're coming from, right?
Yeah.
And really, I want to know, like, what evidence do you have that would suggest the founding fathers weren't religious? And really, the fun game for me is I can take the painting. There were 56 signers of the Declaration. I can take the painting where there's a committee of 5 presenting the Declaration, John Hancock sitting in the chair at the table, right? And I can say, okay, of the 56 signers of the Declaration, how many can you name? Right? And I'll jokingly, I'm like, now let me help you. George Washington did not sign the Declaration. He was military, right? James Madison, Alexander Hamilton didn't sign the Declaration. They were military.
Right.
Let me help you further. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin all signed the Declaration. Who else can you name? Now, the reason this matters is,
I'm glad you weren't asking me, because I don't think I would have been able to answer.
I didn't want to put you on the spot, right?
Yeah.
But the reason it matters is I want to help them understand we're jumping to a lot of conclusions. You're making a lot of assumptions.
Right, yeah.
When you don't even know who they were.
Yeah.
So then how do you know what they believed or what they didn't believe, right? How do we know? What proof and evidence do we have?
Right.
And there's a lot of things that I can walk through on the flip side, because I'll point to people like, well, have you ever heard of John Witherspoon? He was the president of Princeton University, which was a Bible college at the time.
Correct.
He was recruited to Princeton from Scotland, where he was a pastor helping lead the Scottish Awakening.
Yeah.
And he was recruited because he was a Presbyterian, and Princeton was a Presbyterian college, and they'd have a Presbyterian pastor to be in charge of Presbyterian college. He was an active pastor at the time he signed the Declaration.
Yeah.
Now, he's one of many I can go through that were involved in the Christian ministry, but this is the point, is people have never heard the name John Witherspoon.
Yeah.
So it's easy to jump to conclusions or make assumptions when you don't have knowledge, or when you've been fed a steady stream of generalizations. Well, we know the founding fathers weren't religious. They were atheists, agnostics, and deists. And I'm always like, okay, which ones? Who? Because the only founding father that ever self-identified as a deist was Benjamin Franklin.
Mm-hmm.
But he did it in his autobiography, which you can find online. I want to encourage people, go look this up. You can search his autobiography online, right? Go to it on Google Books, the search tab, and type in deist and see what pops up. Because there's like 2.5, 3 paragraphs.
Yeah.
And he says, when I was 15 years old, I was reading the debates between some pastors and some deists. And I thought, the deists are making a better argument than the pastors are. So I determined I was going to be a deist. Next paragraph. Upon further consideration, it appeared to me that although their arguments were better in some respects, that the belief itself was not going to be of any use to me and was of no real benefit to anyone else, so I quickly left that belief behind.
Yeah.
The only founding father that ever self-identifies as a deist said that he quickly left it behind, so he's a deist for maybe a day and a half, right? Like, that's who you have.
Yeah.
But people have never read his autobiography. They've never read the writings of Franklin or Washington or Jefferson or Adams. We spend our time digging into this research, and I can acknowledge, I wouldn't say every founding father was a Christian, but even the guys like Franklin, who I would say weren't a Christian, he still advocated that we should follow the teachings of Jesus and the principles of the Bible because it would allow us to be the freest society that there had been.
It works.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because you were talking about, a lot of these people were believers, they're Presbyterian pastors. And that's what I tell people, like, do you realize that how much of a influence that pastors had?
Yes.
In the founding of our nation?
100%.
It's crazy.
So to give you a tidbit on that, there was a professor from Duke University back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Her name was Alice Baldwin. She wrote a book called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. In her book, she identified that if you look at the Declaration, every single issue in the Declaration had been preached from American pulpits prior to 1763, right? A dozen years before there's ever a revolution, there's ever a Declaration of Independence. And the reason it matters, she points out, is when the Founding Fathers come up with all their ideas were not ones they came up with. It's what they had learned from their pastors that they get together and like, hey, we should do this one. Those were all their pastors' ideas. And this was a noted historian from Duke University, writes an entire book on the subject. And this is what today people don't understand. This used to be common knowledge, like understood throughout America, the Christian foundation of this nation. And it's only been in more recent decades that people have begun to buy into this notion that, no, we were always secular. We should be secular. We don't want God involved. No, we will not succeed if God's not involved. If you remove the principles of Christianity in the Bible, it's very similar to what David wrote in the Psalms. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? If you pull the foundation out from the house, it won't stand.
Yeah. So we see this infiltration happening in our country, and it's attacking every issue, gender, sexuality, and immigration. Immigration is a huge issue right now, and a concern for many voters too. Who did the founding fathers say or see as responsible for immigration?
This is a really fascinating question. We're in the middle of a research project on this right now. The Constitution outlines the specific role of the federal government. They were called enumerated powers. And most of them are like in Article 1, Section 8, the powers of what Congress has. But the Constitution literally says, here's what Congress can do, here's what the president can do, here's what judiciary can do. And it lays out those powers. It then goes on to say that any power not granted to the federal government belongs to the state. Well, the Constitution had very little to say on immigration, and this is where the Founding Fathers believe that's really a state issue. Why? Because if you were coming to America, even though generally speaking you were coming to live in the United States of America, no, that's not where you're really living. You were living in Virginia or Pennsylvania or Delaware, and so those states would determine some parameters of what was required to live in their state, and the Constitution allowed states to have a significant voice, and by allowed, meaning that because the Constitution didn't say this is a role of the federal government, by default, it says this is the role of the states. And it wasn't until there was 2 Supreme Court decisions, one in 1875, one in 1876, where the Supreme Court said, yeah, really the federal government should step in and help fix some immigration issues we're having. It's an interesting thing to wrap your head around. Immigration was not a federal issue really until you get to about the 1890s, because that's when Ellis Island opened. And all of a sudden we have this main federal immigration port. Before that, it was always a state issue. And the reason for the founders, that made the most sense is because at the local level, you have more control by your local populace because of who they're voting for, and the representatives are reporting directly to them. And so there was, it wasn't this distant, absent somebody in Washington, D.C. that we don't know, we haven't seen in years or months or whatever it is. No, this was something that people were directly accountable to the people, and they had a big say in this, and they believed it belonged primarily to the states and the local level to handle their own immigration issues.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It's so counterculture what we're hearing.
Right.
In all the news and all the media, it's crazy. So My Faith Votes, we call for Christians to pray,
yes,
and to think and to vote. Obviously, immigration is such a huge issue.
Yeah.
How is the Christian to think about this issue? Because I think I see it in two ways. We got two lanes. We've got one care and compassion and one law and order.
Yes.
Are they in sync with each other, or am I missing something? Like, how do we think about this before we go to the polls?
It's such an important question, and this is where it's a challenge for people sometimes, but you can't walk and chew gum, right? Like, two things can be true at once.
Yeah.
And when you go back to the very beginning, when God creates Adam and Eve, right, he creates individuals, the individual capacity, but then from individuals, he creates families. We would say that's an institution God created.
Right.
Well, we also know that God creates an institution of government. We could maybe go to Genesis 9, where God gives Noah what were considered the laws of Noah. They became known as the Noahide laws. And in that was things for civil government. And then God creates an institution of the church, really, right? It's Exodus. It's a temple. It's Aaron, Levites. But we know there's three institutions. And one of the important ways to think through this is whose jurisdiction does this fall in?
Yeah.
Right? Because if we're talking about a nation, who's supposed to be in charge of protecting the citizens of the nation? The government.
Yeah.
Now, why that matters is the government's been charged with, the founding fathers believe, right, the role of the government is to protect your God-given rights. What you see in Scripture is the role of the government is to punish the wicked and to reward the righteous.
Right.
That's the
Romans
primary
13.
role.
Yep.
Right? That's a primary role of government. The role of government is not compassion. Now it's interesting because in justice, right, if there was someone who's a murderer and the judge is like, I'm going to have compassion, I'm going to say not guilty. That's
no
not
justice.
your job,
Yeah.
right? The family,
That's good.
right, from the murder victim, they can say, we forgive you. But the role of the government is to protect citizens, to do justice, to punish the wicked. And when you look at immigration, the primary role of government is to protect its citizens. Right now, if you have an open border, the government, just by self-evident understanding, cannot be protecting its citizens because they don't even know who's coming into this nation. We do know that there are nations in Central and South America that are emptying out their prisons from violent offenders, right? Murderers, sexual predators, and they're sending them up because they know they can get them out of their country. They don't have to pay for them in prison, and America's embracing them. The federal government is messing up on this issue. Now, here's where you can walk and chew gum. We can still look and say, but we do have a broken immigration system in America. I would agree with that assessment.
Right.
When you look at people that have tried to be legal immigrants and they've gone through a 4, 5, 6, 7-year process to become a legal immigrant, when they're people that love America, they have jobs, they have homes, they want to be here, we should make it easy for people that want to be here to be here. And it should be a challenge for people who have bad intentions to make it into this nation.
Yeah.
That should be an obvious immigration
Seems
statement.
like a no-brainer, but
Right.
for some it's not.
But that's not what we're doing. So this idea where someone would say, well, right, if we put up a border, that's not loving. Well, hang on. The role of the government is to protect its citizens.
Yeah.
It would be unloving for the government not to protect their citizens, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've confused this concept. And it's not to say that, we should have bigger ports of entry and there should be more agents to process. Now, that's a different conversation. But at that point, we're still saying we want to know who comes in to make sure we're not releasing murderers and rapists and drug dealers, whoever else, into the nation without knowledge. The role of the government is to protect their citizens.
Yeah.
And right now, I mean, it should not be confusing to anyone. The government's not protecting citizens when it comes to the immigration issue. This is something as Christians that it should be clear. And we can go further. If you look in Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, even some in Exodus, it talks about if there are strangers that come into your land, there is one law for the stranger, for the sojourner, and for God's people. Well, God's standard was if people are going to live here, they need to follow the laws.
Right.
That's not a racist thing to say, right? That's also not something that should be super subjective. If you come here, you should want to be here, number one. And number two, you should follow laws. And the laws are, there is a legal process to get in. And again, we can talk about should that be changed. That's a different conversation than saying we're not going to follow the laws and open it up and everybody comes in.
Yeah, that's so good. So outside of immigration, we know that's a big deal. What do you see as one of the biggest concerns to you coming into this big election year?
I would say one of the things that I know you guys are very concerned with, and it's the fact that Christians actually show up and vote.
A to the men.
And the
Yes.
reason, right, but the reason it's becoming a bigger deal now is there are literally campaigns to try to diminish Christian voter turnout,
Yeah.
right? And whether it's, well, we know it's all rigged, right? Or, you know, there's ballot harvesting and there's mail-in ballots and people are cheating, and so it doesn't even matter. And what I try to challenge, remind Christians about, if you go to some of the parables of Jesus, so often Jesus' parable started off and he would say, the kingdom of heaven is like this.
Yeah.
Right? Well, if you go to Matthew 25, Luke 19, it was a parable of talents and the minas.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of that, who got rewarded? And you could say, well, those that were profitable, those were productive. And I would say, no, those that were faithful.
Yeah.
Because if you are faithful doing the right thing, you know what happens? You're often productive in what you do, right?
Yeah.
If you are faithful doing your job, you will be productive. But they weren't rewarded. He didn't say, well done, good and productive servant. He said, well done, good and faithful servant.
Yeah.
This is even one of the things that the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy, and he says, this is a trustworthy saying. And in verse 13, I think it's 2 Timothy 2:13, he says that even if we are faithless, God remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Faithfulness is a part of God's character, and it should be part of our character. Well, part of our faithfulness should be doing the right thing. We should be faithful to do the right thing. And voting is something that we should not allow our emotions to be swayed and say, well, my vote doesn't matter, but your faithfulness does.
Yeah. Faithfulness, and that's a stewardship thing too.
100% stewardship, because in America, more than almost any other nation, arguably in the history of the world, when we have our Constitution that recognizes we, the people, are in charge, we're the ones that get to choose, which means if we have ungodly leaders, it's because we chose poorly or because we didn't choose at all because we didn't show up.
Yeah.
And Christians, I would say the number one issue going forward, Christians have to be involved. And Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation. Righteousness is not determined by someone's personality, but rather by their policies. And this is a big deal because a lot of times we go, I don't like that person. Okay, I get it, but let's measure policies.
Yeah.
And as a Christian, righteousness is not all that confusing because God is a God of life. God is a God of male and female. He created them, and that's what marriage looks like.
Yeah.
God is a God that Israel is still the apple of his eye. Like, you can kind of go down this list. What does righteousness look like? Issues that should not be that confusing for Christians, and this is not determined on someone's personality, right? This is their policies. Who stands for the unborn? Who believes that marriage is a man and woman? Who believes that man and women are actually things, right? Who believes that we should be friends of Israel? Well, those are not complicated issues. Mm-hmm. And then we can go further. Proverbs 29:2, when the righteous are in authority, people rejoice. We have the opportunity to put godly, righteous people there. And the reason we would rejoice is because when we do the godly things, we enjoy God's blessings, and therefore we are rejoicing because life is better.
Yeah.
Because God's ways work. But we have to have people that understand and believe and promote God's ways for them to get those policies so we can enjoy those blessings. If Christians aren't involved in the process, we're never going to have that.
Yeah.
Christians have to faithfully show up with their stewardship and vote. And I think that is the biggest issue in this coming election.
Yeah, I agree. We are my faith votes. Our faith is in God. We remain faithful, and we just trust God with the outcomes.
Amen.
And he's going to be good to us.
That's it.
Tim, thank you so much, man.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.
Great having you.